Hi, I'm David Morgenroth. I'm on the faculty of the University of Montana. Glad to have you listening and watching today. I'm very excited about sharing some things that I've thought about over a number of years, and let's get to it. Today, let's talk about this chord-scale relationship and the conundrum that lies between them. When I say conundrum, I mean there's a bit of a chicken and egg factor. What came first, the chord or the scale? And when we look at the harmonic series, we get a little bit of a clue. So the harmonic series is a series of intervals that you hear on any given note that we play, particularly on the piano. Other instruments, certain intervals may not be particularly present, but on the piano, and then it gets chromatic. So we start with an octave, fifth, fourth, both of those, all those are perfect. And then we get into thirds, and the first thing we see is that we have a dominant seventh chord, and then followed by a scale that starts looking a little bit like a Lydian scale, and then we get into some pretty crunchy intervals up there. They aren't purely tuned as we would like them to our modern ears, but indeed, in the harmonic series, we have a chord and then what amounts to a scale, and then it goes into chromatics. So the whole universe of sounds are included in the harmonic scale, including some that we are not particularly familiar with in Western music. So the harmonic series helps us a little bit, but doesn't help us a lot. So my experience tells me that a lot of students that are watching this video come to college, and their experience with theory is fairly limited. That was sure my experience. When I went to college, I didn't get any kind of theory from my piano teacher. Where I got theory was from jazz and from reading theory books. That's kind of nerdish, I know. But theory is something that is absolutely mandatory for a jazz student, and particularly for a jazz piano player. So when we talk about chords and scales, those are the fundamentals, those are the meat on the bones of what we work with as jazz players. And so we want to know the scales, and we want to know the chords. So you can create chords out of the scales that you already know. The big scales that you probably know, that I certainly was drilled on over and over when I was in high school in particular, were the major scales, the harmonic minor scales, and the melodic minor scales. So today let's look at the major scale. Simple enough. We know the major scale because it's been drilled into us. We don't know what the theory behind it is, but we're going to look at that a little bit. So how do we build a chord out of a scale? Well, we work with theory which is called tertiary. That means based on thirds. So what we want to do with the major scale is build a chord based on thirds of that major scale. So we'll skip the first interval and go with the third. So that's C to E in a C major scale, up to the fifth, G, up to the seventh. So that's a major seventh based on the major scale. If we continue on up, we have the ninth, that's the D in the C major scale. We have an F, which is the fourth of the major scale. And then we have finally the A, which is the sixth, or the 13th in this case. So the 2, 4, and 6 can also be considered 9, 11, and 13. So just put that away for a second. So with those 7 notes, we have all 7 notes in the scale. So if I took this triad up here and put it inside this 7th chord, I'd have basically the entire C major scale. So that is mode number 1 of the C major scale. You've probably heard of modes before. You may have heard about modes in your maybe your first semester theory class. Modes can be looked at in 2 ways, just like chords and scales. We're not going to get too far into this, but this particular major scale is called the Ionian scale. We have Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. And those are all built on each note within the scale. One thing I'd like to bring out here is that this chord, as we've built it, is not the most harmonious type of chord that we could have. And one of the things we as jazz players do is we raise that fourth interval, which is the 11th, and we call it a sharp 11. And presto, we have what is actually a Lydian scale now. Only this scale is the Lydian of G major because it has one sharp. We'll get into modes in another episode, but basically one of the advantages of knowing how chords and scales work together like this, you can build a chord out of a scale, and then we can do the opposite, which is what we just did, building a Lydian scale out of this chord. There's your Lydian, C Lydian, is that you can start working back and forth between the chords and scales, and that's what I'd really like to see my students do, because ultimately the piano is just topography, and this is the reason why all instrumentalists need to have some piano skills, because you can't really learn theory that well without the piano. The piano tells all, it shows it all. And so part of our advantage of being piano players is that we have this visual, and we can see this, and instantly we can see, got a major 7 and a D major triad, and there you have a C major 7 sharp 11. So the goal is to take that scale knowledge that you probably learned through your high school and even grade school years of taking piano lessons, and start to build chords this way in thirds, and you can quickly find out what works and what doesn't, and we can go over a number of these things. In future videos, we'll talk about all of the major chords, all of the minor chords, and all of the dominant chords, as well as augmented and diminished chords, and how they relate to their scales, and vice versa. So I wish you well. Just keep experimenting with this sort of thing, and we'll see you another time.